we made some of it completely self-service. So if you hit a certain set of criteria and you've been developing Johnny as a succession for this person over here for a year, that person moves, you can demonstrate you've met the criteria. You can literally just move Johnny from point A to point B, just like that. And managers, either consciously or unconsciously, sort of protect and reinforce the silos around their team, and they're doing it just because they want to drive performance and they want to drive the right outcomes and things. But the result of that is you get this embedded culture, which is that if I'm in this team, I work for this person, or if I run this business, these are my people, and that could be a positive. I'm accountable for their development and their growth and all the rest of it. But it can also be a massive negative because it stops those people then moving to where they might need to be.
You're very welcome to another episode of Hiring Excellence. My name is Johnny Campbell. I'm your host for this podcast and CEO and co-founder of Social Talent. And today we're going to be talking about building internal mobility at scale. We've been talking about internal mobility a few times over the last few years on the show, but I've noticed in the last 12 months, this has become a really hot topic for recruiting teams, sometimes as an evolution of the skills first strategy conversation. But we're really seeing some real movement in internal mobility initiatives run through recruiting and a real maturation of the topic. And no better organization to dig into this than to understand what Microsoft have been doing. And to expand on this, we're welcoming back Thom Staight. Thom's been on the show before. Thom has been a good friend for the last number of years. We've known each other through most of his career in Microsoft, which has spanned almost more than 11 years. Thom recently left Microsoft as the General Manager of Global Talent Acquisition for EMEA and Asia. And he's joining me today to share with us a little bit about his story and his team's story in terms of how they scaled internal mobility at scale in Microsoft. Thom, welcome back to the show. It's been a couple of years since you last joined us when you first shared about what Microsoft was doing around AI in the recruiting team back then. Where are you joining us from? Remind us a little bit about your career and background, because I love hearing you. I think you're a super smart mind. I heard you on stage at LinkedIn's Talent Connect early this year in London, and you brought a real life to the panel and conversation, always full of insights. But maybe tell us about yourself. Tell us about your football woes as well. You know, we're coming back off the back of the World Cup. We won't talk about what results have come in or not come in by the time this broadcast. But yeah, welcome back to the show, Thom. Maybe reintroduce yourself to our audience.
Thank you. Good to be here. Yeah, so I was until really recently, the head of TA for our teams in EMEA and Asia, our TA teams at Microsoft. And I've been there a long time, been there 11 years. So in that time, I've done nearly all the TA jobs you can do at Microsoft. When I first joined, I was hired to set up the sourcing teams. Microsoft didn't really had sourcing teams, but didn't really have structured ones. So I was hired to do that first of all. And that's when you and I first met, when
That's right.
You came in and helped train up a lot of people really fast. And that was great. It's been a brilliant ride at Microsoft. We've been through one really major transformation. So Satya's been there longer than I was been there, but it was a kind of fresh transformation. So we went from the enterprise software company to being a cloud business, and it's then kind of evolved ever since. And my job and TA has evolved along the way. So yeah, it's been a long journey. It's been a good journey, and it's been hopefully got some interesting stuff to share as well.
Thom, you're what I would describe as somebody who's loyal to their employers. You've really only had two employers in your career. You seem as loyal to your employers as you are to your football teams, and maybe more success with your employers than your football teams. Although of late doing well.
I'm an Arsenal fan, just for clarity, and we have just won the Premier League for the first time in a long time. So, but yeah, I had a long and painful trip to and from Budapest for the Champions League final, which was, the journey there was all right. The journey home was pretty painful. So sitting on a bus.
Well, you're a man who's used to long journeys to get the result, right? Which is maybe gonna work nicely into our story today. But Thom, before I get into the change at Microsoft, walk us back. Talk me through maybe your career moves. You joined Page a long time ago. Technically not your first job out of college, but talk to me how you ended up in Page, how you ended up in recruiting, what you did there, and maybe reintroduce what Microsoft looked like 11 years ago?
I mean, I fell into recruitment like a lot of people do. So my only jobs before Page were straight out of uni, undergraduate trainee jobs, and I was in the insurance industry, and I didn't want to do that. So I was kind of walking around London applying for jobs and going into recruitment agencies, trying to find something which would be the thing that I would want to do. And there was a week when I went to, I think, 2 or 3 different recruitment agencies for different jobs. And I had the same experience in every agency where they went, no, we absolutely can't put you forward for this job. But have you thought about working in recruitment? And after the third time, I was like, probably I should start thinking about working in recruitment because maybe I'm not actually qualified for anything else. So I decided to do it properly. I applied to, I think, about 12 different recruitment agencies. And this was the late 90s. This was kind of building up to the real peak of the dot-com boom. So recruitment agencies were hiring like crazy. So I've got interviews everywhere. And I pretty quickly realized that there was a kind of a real hierarchy of professionalism and quality. And there was somewhere you were never going to go and build a career. And there's somewhere you will get trained. So I thought, right, I'm just going to try and find the right one. And I chose Page. It wasn't I'm not saying it's the best agency or the most professional, but certainly for the time I was there, they were really, really good. I think probably still are good, hiring people who were pretty young, hiring on skills and behavioral competency. And that's how we interviewed for people. We didn't care what they'd done before. And then really, really training you on the fundamentals of recruitment and the fundamentals of sales. And it was quite a high pressure environment. It was definitely a hard work environment. Some people hated it. I absolutely loved it. And I wasn't so successful immediately because it was such a fun environment. I was probably having too much fun in my first 6 months to be successful immediately. But by the end of the first year, I realized that I'm actually quite good at this, and I can earn decent money doing this as well. So I kind of knuckled down, and that was it. I didn't really, to your point, I am loyal both to my football team, been with the same woman for 25 years as well. I think, by nature, if I'm in somewhere where I think, and Page felt like a real meritocracy, like if you were successful, you were given autonomy, very, very high accountability culture. And that suited me. So you keep on growing, keep on delivering. And I never really felt like I was doing the same role for a long time. Your job, the business changes so much, and they're pretty good at, they didn't call it talent management, but they're pretty good at talent management, moving people around, not letting anyone get stale, really. So if you get stale on one desk or on one business, they'll flip you onto something else. I probably did stay there too long. I got to a point when I wasn't sure what I was going to do next. And I was in that kind of classic, I was very fixed that I wasn't going to go in-house. And I spent about 2 years thinking about what is the career transition I'm going to do. And I looked at a few things. And what I kept coming back to is actually that I did really, really like recruitment. I enjoy the business of recruitment. And I got lucky, really. A friend of mine, had 2 friends of mine had joined Microsoft, one through the Nokia acquisition, where he'd been running exec recruitment, and one who had joined and gone in to set up a corporate functions recruitment role. So when Satya, as CEO, one of the things he went to his HR leader and said, look, Microsoft's got this amazing reputation for retaining people and moving people around the company. So you'd meet people at Microsoft when I joined, who'd been there 20 years, and they'd have worked across engineering, sales, marketing, business development, all sorts of stuff, which is amazing. So you have these kind of amazing careers where people are multi-skilled and multi-talented. But one of the things Satya said is the pivot we need to make as a company is so dramatic. I mean, to do it so quickly. We don't have people who've got the right skills for us to become a cloud-based company or the right mindset. And part of what we're doing is changing the mindset. And so he said, what we need to do is we need to be much better at going externally to recruit, because our culture of just moving people around internally and just developing people, that's not going to be enough in the moment we're suddenly in right now. And because of that, a global TA function was created for the first time under a guy called Chuck Edwards, who's just retired from Microsoft, actually. And he was a brilliant leader, and he pulled together a load of people internally. He also he and the leadership team he put together, they specifically went out and recognized there are some skills in recruiting that we need more of. We've got them in some places, but we need more of that. And it was the kind of things that, for those of us who've grown up in agency, particularly if you've done that in the UK and Europe, which was a bit more mature and a bit more developed in some of these things than some other parts of the world, we had those skills that Microsoft needed to go out and actively hunt and, frankly, to sell. Microsoft was not, the second half of my Microsoft career, selling Microsoft has been a piece of cake. I mean, people just want to work there because the job Satya's done has just been transformational in every way. 11 years ago, Microsoft was definitely not cool, 100% not cool. It was making a lot of money, but the share price was starting to go up, but it'd been in the doldrums for like 10, 12 years. It was just a sort of a solid blue chip stock. It wasn't a growth company. It wasn't seen as being an innovative company anymore. So my brief was to come in and set up a sourcing team. And the person who hired me, Elke Jorens, was very open that there's some things about recruiting that we need to learn more of. And there was me and a bunch of other people she brought in. And you'll remember we were trying to, at scale, teach what was a big team. It got bigger afterwards, but I think at that point, Elke probably she was leading the team for Europe at the time. It's probably 80 to 100 people in total. And at the start, I think sourcing made up about 25% of that. But we hired some new people with a new mindset, but we then trained the people we had, and we became much better at that. What was true sourcing, and this would have been sort of 2015 through to about 2018. We were just in hyper growth mode, and the sourcing team grew massively at that time. We kind of drove much more of a sales mindset through the recruiting team, and we became very, very externally focused. We became very front foot because we had to be to offsell AWS with I think Snap called them the 25-pound, 200-pound gorilla, to offsell AWS to be, Google was cooler than us. There's a bunch of other smaller companies. But we worked, we got the people who we needed. Microsoft's business transformation was unbelievably successful. And over time, kind of the revenue changed, the business model changed, share price reflected that, and it became easier and easier and easier to hire. So sourcing still really, really critical to how we hire. But the way in which we did, the evolution of our TA function has partly reflected what's happening externally and how the technology has evolved. It's also reflected Microsoft's market position and the emphasis on where we put effort now. We're a bit more thoughtful around employer branding, about communicating at scale, whereas back in those days it was one-to-one. I've got to find that qualified person. I've got to try and get a conversation with them, and I've got to pitch them on, this is what the transformation vision is for Microsoft, and here's your role in it. So that was like, all of it's been great. I've had a great 11 years, but those first 2 or 3 years, they were really great fun. It all felt really new, really greenfield, and we were truly building something from ground up. It's great.
Hiring is harder than it's ever been. More roles, more pressure, less time. Cara is Social Talent's AI hiring assistant, built on 15 years of real hiring expertise. She helps your team stay consistent, stay compliant, and handle more without burning out. Cara doesn't replace your recruiters, she makes them better. Find out what Cara can do for your team at socialtalent.com, your hiring partner for the AI era.
Tom, you mentioned obviously that Microsoft had a history of being strong around mobility, around talent engagement. They had a reputation for retaining talent and moving people through different departments. So it would sound like, hang on a second, Microsoft never had an internal mobility problem. And maybe they didn't. But I'd love to understand how TA ended up getting involved in internal mobility. And could you take us through the history of that strong culture of mobility that was there when you joined? Did that stay the whole way? And why did it become an issue? And why did it become an issue for TA in the last couple of years?
Yeah, I think there are a bunch of different factors. It's not kind of one thing, but I think the culture as the culture changed with Satya's transformation, I think there probably was something that was lost. That ability to, particularly if you were joining in Seattle, which is HQ, the ability to join in any profession, in any team, and then just to kind of network, apply for any job, sell yourself into the job and have this really varied career, that became harder over time, I think. And it became harder because as the company grew, and don't forget, when I joined Microsoft, it was a company of, I think, 105 to 110,000 employees. If you include all the gaming acquisitions and LinkedIn, it's now like 240,000 or 250,000 employees. So the growth in those years is crazy. But a lot of the roles that we were hiring were becoming really, really specialist. And some of what Satya was saying at that time when I first joined was, we've got lots of solution architects, we've got lots of really brainy, kind of customer facing technical people. But when we put those folk into a cloud environment, it requires a whole new mindset, which it's not something that can't be learned. But if you want to do it faster, you need to find people who already bring that mindset, and then they can help everyone else change. And as we grew as a company, and as roles became more technically focused, and as our product portfolio became much more diverse, particularly on not so much on the product side, because you do see software engineers move from product team to product team, but particularly on the customer facing side, the data showed really clearly that if you have someone who is a real deep domain technical expert in, say, security, engaging with the customer on security, the outcome for the customer is better. And if the outcome for the customer is better, the outcome for us is better. So while you can have someone with the same standard title, it might be solution architect or success manager or customer engineer, that domain expertise is really important. And people can move across those domains, but it isn't necessarily easy, because that's years of acquired domain expertise. So I think that as we learned that, and as our recruitment reflected that, we were hiring more people with deep specialisms. I think probably you still do find people. And by the way, people stay at Microsoft a long time, particularly if they join in Seattle. It's a great company to work for. So, it has got amazing retention. That the attrition is historically very, very low. But I think that the degree of mobility, the internal culture did change. And I think then there's some other sort of environmental facts to go around that as well. Although we're a very, very innovative, very fast moving tech company, we're also now a 50-year-old enterprise. And if you're a 50-year-old anything, you've got some very deeply ingrained, habits and cultures and things that people expect. And one of the great things about being a people manager and running a business unit at Microsoft, and one of the things I experienced at Page and I experienced again at Microsoft, is if you're a people manager, you're given a high degree of autonomy to run your team and run your bit of the business, and a high degree of accountability. So you are absolutely expected to deliver, and you're measured against that. But if you deliver, you've got a fair degree of freedom in terms of how you choose to do that. Now, over the years, you ended up with managers who that accountability and autonomy meant that they got to hire who they wanted. They got to choose who promoted and developed, how they invested their money and time and dollars in developing people. So you ended up with this kind of management culture that the people in a manager's team, they're my people. Now, Satya very early on was like, we are all Microsoft people. Like, no one is your particular person. And he was saying that from very early on in my tenure in Microsoft. So it did help, and it did start to change. And I would say that a lot of the people managers who came into a culture where that was the stated, this is our belief and this is our value, and they would reflect that. But not all of them. If you come in from a culture where, again, your people were your people, then if you're not careful, that's one of those things that kind of leads to you having silos. And managers, either consciously or unconsciously, sort of protect and reinforce the silos around their team, and they're doing it just because they want to drive performance and they want to drive the right outcomes and things. But the result of that is you get this embedded culture, which is that if I'm in this team, I work for this person, or if I run this business, these are my people, and that could be a positive. I'm accountable for their development and their growth and all the rest of it. But it can also be a massive negative, because it stops those people then moving to where they might need to be. And we recognize that. One of our HR strategies evolved, but for years and years and years, we talked about right talent, right place, right time. And that was meant to reflect both external, what's the right external person to bring in. But Johnny might have been right in that role for the last 2 years. But if the customer scenario changes, or we've got a new product coming out, and actually we need Johnny, he can have more impact for us and for the customer somewhere else, then he should move. He should be over there. So that was kind of recognized that we needed to be agile, and we needed to kind of find ways to move people around. But we talked about it a lot, and we definitely did it, but it wasn't happening consistently. And I think that cultural piece is a very difficult thing to change. I think the older or more established your company, the more long-serving the leader, the more embedded some of those cultural beliefs are.
But these things, Tom, are not uncommon in large organizations, and it's also pretty common for people to recognize it and understand it. But it's one thing to recognize it and say it's an issue. It's another thing to say it's also an issue we need to fix and we're going to prioritize. So what might have been the catalyst that actually made it an issue worth tackling when you got involved? Because again, lots of things are there to be fixed and could be improved in an organization the size of Microsoft, and you can't get to them all, and you've got to pick the ones that matter. Why did this matter, and when did that happen?
Well, the first time we tried to make it change, and when I say we, I really mean Chuck Edward. He, like years ago, about 6 years ago, he and I were in a conversation. He was talking to other people about the role that TA was playing in moving talent around. So, and by the way, that was inconsistent depending on which part of the world you were in and which organization you're supporting. There was not the same expectation on the role of TA. So we stood up an expectation in international that anyone could apply for a job internally or externally, and they'd be treated the same. If the recruiter was doing a screen, they'd do the same screen, and the interview would be the same. That wasn't necessarily true in the US. It wasn't necessarily true in all of our engineering organizations. And he recognized this was not ideal, right? We should have something more consistent. And he pushed at this 6 years ago, but the business context was such that there wasn't the appetite to change. I think what's changed last really since COVID. So in tech, everyone knows, like during the COVID period, there's this enormous tech boom, massive demand for everything that a company like Microsoft was offering. And then after that, there was a kind of a screeching on of the brakes, and there was a kind of, we had to do some right sizing, and that was extremely painful. And it was something that, although Microsoft would do reorganizations and do redundancies on a pretty regular basis, because we're being agile and moving around all the time, the scale of what we had to do in terms of really absolute reductions in headcount going back about 3 years ago, and there were several rounds, was extremely painful. The first thing I'd say is that there was a recognition from our senior leadership team down that we didn't want to go through those things, that it wasn't constructive, it wasn't good for the culture, it wasn't a good experience for anyone, for the leaders or for the people who are experiencing it. So the first thing was, how do we manage our resources and our people better so we don't have to do that? And then there was lots of data that we were bringing forward, and TA played a role in this. There was one of the things we shared was that quite a lot of the time we would do a set of structural redundancies. People would leave. We would know they were good people. We could see from their rewards track record they were good. And then 6 months later, we're hiring roles which are not the same, but they're adjacent, certainly from a skills point of view. And we talk a lot about skills adjacency now. You could see that they're adjacent. And guess what? You go out to the market, and because we're hiring at scale, Microsoft something like, we'd have an investment push in the summer, the beginning of our fiscal year most years, and we'd be hiring in the thousands for to do the reshaping and to reflect the needs of customers. And when you're hiring at that scale, quite a lot of the time you go out to the market, particularly if you're in a small company. And when you start looking at people who've got not the exact skills, but the adjacent skills, you're suddenly looking at people who used to work at Microsoft. And quite often, the reason we hired them before is because they were really good. So you start to benchmark them against everyone else about them. You're like, okay, we look like we might be bad to rehire someone who only left us 6 months ago, 18 months ago, 2 years ago. And again, I know it's not unique. I know a lot of other companies, especially in the tech space, I talk to peers in other companies that they've experienced the same thing. But increasingly trying to bring that data forward to say, our finance team would say, look, making redundancies is incredibly expensive. Hiring is also incredibly expensive. Having an empty chair, particularly in sales, where that might drive revenue or it might drive consumption services, that you can absolutely put a dollar cost against that. So if you could be in a place where you didn't make someone redundant, didn't have an empty chair in another part of the business, which is costing money some other way, and actually, we've got great people and we can start to map skills adjacency internally, maybe we save a lot of money, but also we kind of drive better customer experiences. We get product to market faster because we don't have these lags where we've got we've got empty chairs and got teams under pressure. And those things are important. We're kind of like a lot of companies, particularly in the era of AI, we are like the financial basis of our business, of every tech company, is changing. We're much, much more capital intensive. So there's much more of a focus on, if you can find a way of saving money, that's great. There's an incredible emphasis on speed. The sense of urgency in the tech industry at the moment is like nothing I've seen in the 11 years. It's unbelievable. So if you can show that, okay, we can do this by saving the company money, we can be faster, then there's the appetite to want to try and do that is greater than it's ever been before. The business need to try and do that is greater than before. And I think the final thing I'd say is that increasingly, as there's a lot being talked about in Microsoft and other AI companies, we're experimenting with, like, traditional org hierarchies are kind of breaking down. And I'm definitely not going to sit here and say this is what the future org looks like, because I don't think anyone knows. But a lot of what we're experimenting with, and Satya has talked about publicly, and others in Microsoft have, is these kind of flatter structures where you don't think about teams, you think about the work that needs to get done. So it doesn't matter who you work for. If you have the right skills to get a piece of work done, that might be a customer project, it might be building a product, or whatever it might be. You come together in a group, a squad or a cohort, whatever you choose to call it. You deliver the work, and then that cohort breaks up, and you get allocated to more work. That's a really, really different way of working. So bits of our organization are now doing that really well. We're not doing it across all of Microsoft, but bits of the organization doing that really well and showing a new kind of agility. So when you look at that and you say, if this is the future of the way in which companies, or at least a company like Microsoft, needs to organize itself, we need to learn new ways of not only moving people in from a traditional job one to job two, whether that's through recruitment, a talent management move, a restructure. We also need to evolve a culture where, agility is the first expectation, because you have to be more agile. You have to do things faster. You have to be fast to get your product to market. You have to be faster because the customer expects you to solve their problem immediately. And we have to solve those problems in a different way. Customers need us to lean in on the technical side of it, perhaps more than we have done on some of those things in the past. So I think that it's not a TA thing or a talent management thing or an HR thing, that the business context and the customer context has changed so much, and it's still changing so much. All of those things are those separate factors. They're all pushing at the same time, which means that the last couple of years, when you bring forward those conversations that Chuck raised like 6+ years ago, suddenly people are listening to them in a different way. And there's a kind of, well, how could we do this? And how could we make that work in a different way? So yeah, I think it's context is the most important thing. It's the right conversation at the right time.
So Tom, this is the point where normally in a conversation like this, we move on to, okay, so you went to market, selected a vendor, tell us about the process, tell us about the vendor you selected. But this isn't a technology conversation, or isn't mainly a technology conversation that we want to have, because your thesis is that perhaps people get it wrong when they think the solution to an internal mobility issue or to skills approach to an organization is a technology problem. Sure, there's technology involved, but you hinted at it earlier when you mentioned that Chuck had tried this 6 years ago. It wasn't the technology that failed. If I remember what you said, it was a lack of appetite, which hints at cultural, organizational norms. So walk me through how you thought about this challenge and how it plays out. What are the challenges of really doing this at scale? Yeah, and beyond the technology to do it, or is the technology even is it even the first, second, the third thing on your mind?
It was definitely there in the conversation. The tech is definitely part of it, because I don't think and I hate the phrase internal talent marketplace, but when products first came out that called themselves internal talent marketplaces, I don't think they worked, especially not in something of massive scale like a 200-person company. But you're right, we didn't start there, but I definitely think tech was an enabler at some point. And there was a piece in the back of the brain, which was, that this is something we think we can go after. I think where we started from was we started from, and the push from both our previous chief HR officer and our current chief HR officer was, how do we as an HR function? And I think the other thing that's important to say is that, TA played a role in something which is a cross HR conversation. And often when I talk to other TA leaders, they're trying to solve the problem on their own. And I mean, that absolutely can't be done. The push came from chief HR officer who sits on the SLT, who's saying, we have to help the company be more agile. So when leaders say they feel friction in trying to move people around in all these different scenarios, we have to take that friction out of the process. If we are the friction, how do we get rid of the friction? And how do we people instead? So where it started, and the other thing I should say is that separate to that, I'd always had this hobby horse, which was when you look at we have something called employee signals, which is the normal internal employee survey. The whole time I've been at Microsoft, the main reason people left was for new career opportunities. And at different times, you hear people get frustrated. Like, we're hiring so many people in different jobs. Why would you leave for new career opportunities? And to me, the answer seemed really obvious. It was that if you're a Microsoft and doing an amazing job, then you work ridiculously hard. I mean, it's a hard work environment, like most big companies are, right? And top performers tend to be the ones who are working the hardest. They get given the most work, are the busiest. So you don't have time to go and look on the career site. You don't have time to go and network around internally in the way you probably should do. And you don't need to, because, if you're at Microsoft, you're being headhunted by, the sourcing team at every other tech company. And this was the thing that Chuck got years ago. He was like, and I would sit there with others in TA. We had this conversation, which is that we understand what's happening because we're the people running the sourcing teams doing the exact same thing to the folk at Google, right? And the folk at AWS. And that's not happening internally. So no, we have a culture that will give you all you need to do to develop your own career at Microsoft. You're accountable for then going and doing it, right? You own your career. And I don't have a problem with that, by the way. We still have that. There has to be you can't spoon feed people their careers. You have to have agency. But if you give people agency and then you don't help them navigate big complex companies, then that's very difficult. So I think we had already been pushing on the TA side to say, sometimes we're in this ridiculous situation where we know, because some of our recruiters have been here ages, we know really well qualified people available for a job that we're working on, and we're not formally really allowed to go and talk to them. And every now and then a recruiter would, on the sly, grab someone and say, I don't know if you've seen it, but I've got this job posted and you're perfect. And then someone would apply. But we weren't really supposed to do that. The rules of engagement were that TA didn't do that. You would be reactive to an internal applicant, but you wouldn't go out and source. And we made the mistake early on from a TA point of view, and I made the mistake, I should say, of talking about this as being internal sourcing. And it took me a while to realize that was like a triggering thing for a lot of leaders to hear. They didn't want their people sourced by Microsoft's TA team because they were defending headhunters from every other company from taking their people. So that was a mistake early on that I made, was using the wrong language and not framing it in the right way. But we got to the point when the push came from the CHRO, because it's been Tom's hobby horse within GTA for years. My boss said, right, go and join this piece of work. Go and work with the person who ran our talent management center of excellence. Work with them and how we think about end-to-end internal movement. And the two of us sort of sat down with a bunch of other people joined, and we went out and spoke to loads of people across HR and the business. And we basically went through and mapped all the different ways that people moved internally at the moment. And we identified that the feedback from the business was absolutely right. There was a lot of friction. We didn't make it easy. And some of that was intentional. Some of that friction we put in to try and ensure we had like fairness in terms of how people got access to opportunity, to make sure that from an inclusion point of view, we were being inclusive and taking time to look broadly. But some of the things we were doing was unintentional friction, and it really, and if you stopped and put yourself, you listen to stories, you talk to a leader, and you think, yeah, that's not good. We shouldn't do that. So the sort of smaller working group sat down and mapped out a series of scenarios and said, right, if we simplify it, really you've got 3 or 4 different types of scenario where movement happens. We talked about it as employee-led movement and then company-led movement. And we said, how do we simplify all those? There's also some work done on top of the employee survey around what employees actually want. And what employees said they wanted was they wanted to understand what jobs were, and they wanted to understand whether they were qualified for a job before they applied for it. And if they weren't qualified for it, the other thing which we need from our surveys, we have so much learning content, and because of our LinkedIn ownership, we've got access to all the learning on LinkedIn. But it is absolutely true to say it's really hard to find the bit that's relevant, really hard. An employee said, I'm happy to own my career and to have that agency, but you have to help me understand that job with that weird title, what does it actually mean? Because I wouldn't know I was qualified for it based on the title. And if I'm not qualified, and it sounds like a great job, how do I get qualified? So there was then and the talent management team did a lovely piece of work around describing what that employee journey should look like. We then looked at whether it's a piece of recruitment, whether it's a talent management situation, whether it's a reorg situation. We said, what should be the routes that we give people? And by people, I mean the managers and the leaders. What routes do we give them to make those changes happen? And we also, I think that, we removed a lot of the friction, including some of the intentional friction we put in, because we realized that the business situation had changed. The need for agility and to reshape the business was the most important business priority. So we removed some of that, and we made some of it completely self-service. So if you hit a certain set of criteria and you've been developing Johnny as a succession for this person over here for a year, that person moves, you can demonstrate you've met the criteria, you can literally just move Johnny from point A to point B, just like that. And we hadn't made that easy before. There was all sorts of hoops you had to get through and sign on. So it took some big decisions around how comfortable are we giving and what we give managers and what we take away from managers. And we built up some recommendations based on feedback. The simplifying was the really important part. We took that to the HRLT. They bought into that. But I think when we came up with this range of solutions on what we thought should happen, some of it got thumbs up from everyone immediately. We hit more resistance with the HRLT than I certainly expected, and I think we as a group expected. And we bluntly rushed into it. We're probably a little bit naive about the way, the assumption was, yes, some of our leaders won't like some of this, because what we're saying is on some of these moves is that, as a leader, you no longer will get full control. We are going to create a scenario where within a certain set of guardrails, the TA team, if they have an open rec, will be able to see there are qualified people in your team, even if they haven't applied. Under these circumstances, the recruiting team can reach out to them and ask them to apply. And it is an ask them to apply. It's not we're very clear. We're not going to start pitching and being aggressive like we would be with an external candidate. We expected leaders to be resistant. We underestimated how some of the HR leaders would resist that. Not because they didn't understand the business context and what we're trying to achieve at the Microsoft level. But if you're a line, and I'm not criticizing these HR people, by the way, if you're a senior HR line leader and you're really aligned to your business and you get to know that person, you get to be able to predict how they're going to react to things and how they think about things. You also start to, because you're empathizing so strongly with your leader, you start to think like them and understand it. So they could see the downside to this. They're like, well, where's that going to leave my leader? My leader's got a really great group of people. What happens if recruiting suddenly start taking lots of people out of that team? That's going to stop him being able to deliver what he's trying to do. So these are justified concerns which we expected to get from business leaders, didn't expect to get from the HRLT. So we did get into a bit of that earlier in the change management process than we expected. We hit resistance. It probably made the storytelling piece and the business justification that we were bringing out stronger, but it also limited we had to kind of be slightly less ambitious in some of the change we were making. We put more guardrails around when will TA reach out, how will TA reach out. But we have got to a point now, it all landed, it went live last year here. We are now at a point when we have both given leaders and managers far greater freedom without needing to engage either talent management, HR, or recruiting to move people around internally, and they can self-service that through our systems. And we've got, and we're at a point now, partly tech-enabled, where, and I should really talk about skills-based organizations and all the stuff that came before, because I feel like I'm jumping around, but an important thing I haven't talked about. Years ago, we made the decision to become more of a skills-based organization and went through a huge exercise to build a skills taxonomy for the whole company. And a company as big and diverse as Microsoft, you can imagine how long that took. And we ended up with something which was big and gnarly. There was then a couple of years afterwards where we made that smaller through skills-based work. But that work, while I know I was a bit cynical of it for a while, I was like, this is too big to be effective. As it evolved and it matured and the skills library got smaller, it did become something that was actually useful. And why that was important is that alongside the newer versions of the internal talent marketplace tech really meant that you could start to build an employee experience which gave employees what they wanted. Because an employee could say, right, I know what my job is. I can see what skills I've got. I can then have this skills-based profile, which I can manually add to, by the way. So if I've got experience prior to Microsoft, which is not reflected, I can add that in. And then I can use that skills mapping to see how I map to every other job in the organization. And if there is a gap, we've then put all of our learning content in there. I can directly be pushed to learning content that helps me get from job 1 to job 2. So all that skills-based taxonomy and the tech really enabled a strong employee journey. And then on top of that, we're able to kind of say, right, we can also use that from a TA perspective. When we build a process and we build something which is acceptable to managers and leaders, we can say, these are the conditions under which we're going to reach out to people. It's not randomized. It's based on this degree of skills matching. It's based on these criteria that the employee has to fulfill. And we were able to kind of build something which is palatable on both sides. It gave the employees a much, much better experience because they were actually, they were being served in a different way. And it also gave enough reassurance to leaders that actually, TA was going to behave in a responsible way. They understood there's some transparency around when they would reach out. I should stress this is early days. So the change management to get to launch, which was in the autumn of last year, took ages. I mean, we worked on this prior to launch for probably 18 months from first conversations through to it going live. So we're now 7-8 months in. And the change management, changing those cultural norms so people get used to it, is going to take years. But I think that we're in a place where, certainly my view is, there's been a kind of give and take with leaders. There's the leaders who have now experienced the fact that, I have really got a lot more flexibility in terms of how I can move people around without needing to engage with HR and go through some what felt to them like bureaucratic processes. That's great. That's helping me do things better and faster. The quid pro quo on that is I also recognize that, there is going to be more internal mobility of people who work for me who might lead my team, but equally maybe I'm getting access to more better qualified internal talent and faster than I might otherwise have done.
Great hiring doesn't just happen. It's a skill. And skills need practice. Social Talent's learning platform gives your recruiters and hiring managers the knowledge to hire with confidence. Expert-led content built for the way people actually work. Whether you're onboarding a new team or upskilling an experienced one, we've got you covered. Visit socialtalent.com/learning to see what your team could learn next.
Tom, it sounds to me like some of the ingredients that I'm hearing from you would include one, that common language, right? Skills, a simplified skills taxonomy is required to be a common language between who the employees are, what the opportunities are, what the learning content is, to kind of connect those three islands, so to speak, with a common language. You can go, oh, this skill over here is learning, over here is how I define it in myself, and over here is the job opportunity. You need that base language to make any of this kind of thing work. Notwithstanding your point perhaps about how originally maybe it was too complicated, it had to get to a simplified level. That's a core tenet to this. The second piece I thought was really interesting, Tom, was you identified the small amount, I think you said maybe 4 or 5 core ways in which mobility happens in an organization. So that makes it manageable and tangible, and obviously highlights that there are differences. There isn't just one way that someone might look for mobility. Business case probably goes without saying, needs to be there. The business appetite for change, it needs to be a big enough problem to actually drive the change that would be necessary. Policies, getting the buy-in, getting the change management. And then obviously the change management itself is a big deal, and
Yeah.
requires not a TA only or a talent management only or an any department only approach. It requires cross-functional support across multiple parts of HR to drive this change forward. There's many things going on there, and it sounds like all of those would be essential to make this work. If you were to summarize the top things that you think, if you're advising somebody externally who's facing into this, what would be your top kind of essentials? Or if there's anything I missed there, you think, oh, you must also do this, that would kind of give a checklist of these are the core ingredients, and you'd expect them to be in any organization of scale.
I think that there has to be the absolute number one thing is there has to be a business imperative that you can tie the whole thing back to. There was a really well understood business imperative, number one, for us to be more agile. And so how can we help give people agility? And then number two, we all understood that we were becoming a much more capital intensive company. And that meant that we had to be smarter in how we used resources and do things in a way that would save money. So if we're investing money and I think it's easy to focus on the cost of making a change like this as a tech investment, which is pretty significant. You have to be able to demonstrate that investment is going to pay off afterwards, and really clearly. Now, if we the mistake we made early on with some of our HR leaders was that we talked a lot in terms of our people strategy and cultural outcomes, and we didn't tie it back robustly enough to how this is how it's going to drive the business outcomes. So I think that without a real business imperative, you're not going to get people aligned behind it, because it's so many things that need to change. I also think that while I was a bit cynical of some of the time and money we invested in building that skills taxonomy, and by the way, I'm not in the camp. There's a lot of people in TA massively negative about skills-based hiring and skills-based organization. And I do understand if you look at hiring in isolation, why. But if you think about, hiring doesn't or shouldn't happen in isolation. If your TA strategy and approach to TA is properly integrated with the way you think about people, talent, job architecture, development of people, the way you're playing career journeys, then suddenly it's just one facet of that. And we couldn't have got to where we are. You certainly can't, I don't think, enable some of the internal marketplace platforms if you don't have a skills-based taxonomy. And I know some of the vendors out there, and you don't need to have done all that work because the platform can do it for you. I think we were always really clear that we wanted to have our own skills taxonomy. And I think if you are a company which is diverse, if you're a smaller company doing one thing, it's probably easier. A company as big as Microsoft that has many different products and services in many different countries, that was something we had to learn and develop ourselves. So that was a foundational step that was done years before, not because this was the end goal in mind, but because it was done, it enabled this work to take place in a different way, I think.
Thom, we're gonna put together a kind of downloadable resource based on your kind of learnings around deploying internal mobility at scale as a handout in the show notes for anyone who's listening to this or watching this live as well. This was all while doing the day job as well, Thom. This wasn't your full-time job. This was you still running global recruiting in Microsoft in an extremely aggressively busy period of time as well. I just must understate that. Thom, after 11 years, I know you're heading off on vacation next, most immediately from this recording, but what's next for you? What are some of the ingredients of the next interesting challenge that you're going to probably look for coming off the back of this? And first of all, you probably deserve a rest first, but after you've taken that rest, what do you think is going to tweak your fancy next?
Yeah, I definitely do need a rest. After 11 years at Microsoft, I'm going to take the longest break I've ever had, which I'm looking forward to. I do think so. I'm a recruiter I've been in recruitment now for a long, long time, right? I still really enjoy recruitment. I enjoy some of the things that haven't changed, the pitching and the closing of candidates. So that will definitely form a part of what I do next. I think what I do see happening in more and more companies is TA becoming much more aligned and integrated into HR strategies and the way we think about talent. And in some companies, that's the role of TA and talent management, talent development has merged. From a selfish point of view, that would be really exciting, because some of the work I've done partnering with peers in our talent management COA for the last 2 years, it would be great to kind of really integrate that an extra step. Microsoft isn't doing that yet. I wouldn't be entirely surprising if they didn't do it in the future, but not doing it yet. But from a personal point of view, I think that even if you don't integrate all of your talent functions under one person, I think that where it works increasingly well is that to get the organizational alignment and get people working better together. So for me personally, I'm going to be working in recruitment forever, I suspect. But I hope it's recruitment and talent management, and maybe even talent development, and thinking about the holistic journey of internal and external talent in a much, much more joined up way. I also think more companies are moving in a direction of, we haven't really talked about redeployment. There's a certain group of companies like the consultancies and outsourcers who are really, really good at redeploying resources at scale. They have that capability well developed in resource management teams. I think other sectors are going to start behaving a bit like that. And I think the obvious function in a company to do that is the TA function. That is the place where you've got the biggest group of people who've got the raw skills needed to do that. So I think that I'm interested to see how our industry evolves in the next 5 years. So hopefully something in the middle of that.
Tom, it's an exciting time. I think I 100% agree with you in terms of that convergence of some of those roles. It's going to give rise to some really interesting positions and opportunities for teams to do great things. It probably teases up nicely for once you've had your break, committed to a new role, to come in and tell us about your next challenge. I have no doubt it's going to be exciting. And yeah, I can't wait to see what's next for you, Tom. But go get a break. I know you're going to travel in South America for the next few weeks, which is well deserved. By the time this airs, maybe we'll know the World Cup winners. But I wish England well in the World Cup. This one or the next, whatever it works out from there. And Arsenal, good luck at the next. As a person who doesn't really follow football, I'm good to say, sure, Arsenal can win everything next year. Why not? No objections.
Optimistic about Arsenal than about England in this World Cup, if I'm honest. But I'll take either. As long as England wins something in my lifetime, that'll be good enough for me, I think.
I can't promise that, Tom, but we'll do our best to get you set up for the next one. Tom, it's been brilliant to chat to you, to get the update, to understand what you've been doing in the last couple of years around mobility. I think it's a really important hot topic that lots of our listeners are grappling with. And I think the insights you can bring from the scale you've done it at are wonderful, really, really good learnings. And thanks for joining us, Tom.
Perfect. Cheers, Tony.
And thank you for listening and taking the time to dig into this topic with Tom. Again, we have a downloadable resource for you to action in the notes and the comments below. Please do grab that. And don't forget, if you want to ask Tom any further questions, dig into his brain on exactly what does he mean by XYZ. Once he's had his break, he's available on LinkedIn. He's Thom with a H, Thom Staight. And Microsoft, do network with him. He's very, very open with his knowledge and help. And he's helped tons of people I know with their issues. And again, great experience on that. We'll be back next week with another great guest in hiring excellence. Until then, take care.